Good morning. My name is Valerie Brown-Kuchera, and with the Student Engagement Office and Forsyth Library, we have procured grants to offer a diversity series this spring, and this is our first speaker today. And I need to let you know that this speaking series is funded by the Humanities Kansas organization and grants. And I'm here to announce the wonderful presentation that we're expecting from Angela Bates. Ms. Bates is from Nicodemus, Kansas, and she is the executive director of the Historical Society there, and also is very instrumental in its status as a national park and research and educational programming and a variety of different very civic-minded activities that go on over in Nicodemus. So I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Bates at this time, and I know we're all going to enjoy learning from her. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I know it's early, but it's probably not early for you guys, right? You get up and you get out and you just have to get the campus walking and getting to where you need to go. Hopefully I won't bore you today. I will say that I'm going to save some time at the end for questions and answers. So if you, as I'm speaking, if there's something that kind of strikes your interest and you want to know a little bit more about it, we can address it at the end of the presentation. And I can talk forever, and I never have a concept of what time it is. So maybe about 10 minutes before, someone can give me, Valerie, maybe you can give me, one of those, because I can keep going. Just a tad bit about me. I'm a descendant of the Nicodemus settlers. Both my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my great-great-great-grandparents that came to Nicodemus, I'm descendants of those people on both my mom's side and my dad's side. And to give you an example of the extreme of that is one time I was doing a presentation at WSU years ago, and I had a slide presentation that I was doing. It was slides in those days opposed to PowerPoints. And I had all of these photographs of all of my great-grandmothers and my great-great-grandmothers and what have you on both sides. And the students said, one student said, how many grandmothers do you have? Because, most of us may know who our great-grandparents are. How many of you in here know the names of your great-grandparents? Great. How many of you have photographs of them? Okay, wonderful. What about great-great? Okay. If this was African Americans, you would have even less hands. And it's just because of our history in this country. So this presentation really is about the children of the Promised Land, but I'm going to always get into the in-depth history of Nicodemus. And I'm a Bates, and Bateses talk really fast. So if you find that I'm going too fast, you can put your hand up and say, slow down. Excuse me. So what I'd like to do is start out talking about slavery in Kentucky and give you a little bit of insight of what it was like to be a slave in Kentucky versus, say, South Carolina or even Mississippi. We all have a tendency to think that slavery is just black and white. If you were African American and you lived in the South, you were a slave. You lived on a big plantation. There was an overseer, and you never got a chance to see your master, and you was always beat. And if you was a woman, you got raped. There's all these stereotypical images that we have in our head about what slavery was like. But believe me, as an African American, I was amazed when I started to dig into the in-depth history of Kentucky. And the reason Kentucky is because the people that started Nicodemus primarily were from the bluegrass, central bluegrass area of Kentucky, the central part of Kentucky. There were people that came in from Tennessee and some other places, but the bulk of the people that came and the bulk of the people that stayed were from the central bluegrass area. Kentucky and slavery in Kentucky was a lot different than it was, say, in Mississippi or the South Carolina or the Carolinas, in that the topography of the land was not conducive to large slave labor. You have mountains, and in the east, the only part of the state that was clear enough to take out the trees and create farms, large farms, they were never even called plantations because they were just never big. And so there was only about 25% of the white people that actually owned slaves, and the bulk of them were in the central bluegrass area. So the crops that they actually grew on these large farms was hemp, and I know you guys are not familiar with hemp. They grew hemp, not for medicinal purposes, but for creating ropes. And so they grew hemp. They also grew tobacco, but tobacco didn't become the king crop until after emancipation, after the Civil War. So what you have is a small group of people, less than really 25% of the white population, that most of them were in the central bluegrass area, that actually owned slaves. And the number of slaves on these farms, these large farms, was an average between 10 and 20, maybe 25 slaves. So you're really talking about families, or a couple of families, or an extended family. So the dynamics of the relationship between the master and his slaves are a lot different than if I was on a slave. I haven't woke up this morning. If I was on a plantation in, say, South Carolina, where they had huge plantations, and they only had an overseer that dealt with these people, so they never really got a chance to see the master or deal with them. So the dynamics and the contrast between those two type of slave environments are drastically different. So also in Kentucky, what you have with these small farms and a smaller group of people being owned, so to speak, you have a relationship where they don't really need the slave labor. And say you own a family, and 3 of the females have had more children. Okay, now you have increased your economic liability. In most places, like in South Carolina, that's a great thing. In Kentucky, when you don't need the slave labor, what you have is a situation that puts a financial burden on the family that is owning them. And so at one time, Kentucky, and Lexington in particular, became known as the Athens of the South. They had 26 slave trading businesses there, and they were exporting slaves out of the state to the southern market. Now, Kentucky was a border state, and so they never seceded from the Union. And even though they had slavery, there was a big rip between the Confederate sympathizers in the state and the ones that wanted to remain with the Union. So there was this rift going on. And so because there was this need for slaves to be exported out of the state, and it was because they didn't need the slave labor. And so it became an economic liability. And as a result, they started really exporting slaves. They didn't want any more slaves coming into the state. And then they became the corner of the market for these African-American mixed blood women. If you was a mixed blood, that means that, you were either half white, or maybe you were 3/4 white. You were either mulatto or quadroon or octoroon. That means you have more white blood in you. These women were very attractive, very, very pretty, and they had the corner of the market to supply the Louisiana market with these women, because the Louisiana French wanted to have mistresses. That was one of the big things that they had down in Louisiana. They would have these big balls that were called masked balls or unmasked balls, and this is when these women were being shown off, so to speak, and they were beautiful, they were dressed beautiful, they were always treated differently, they were never in slave pens, they were in these apartments and what have you. But the point is that Lexington and Kentucky in particular, the way that slavery played itself out was drastically different than it was in other places. And slaves in Kentucky were treated a lot better. The institution, it was bad, period, so let's not get confused about whether it was a good institution or not. It was a bad institution, because no individual should have the right to own another individual. But these people, when they owned these slaves, they had these relationships with them where they would allow them to go to other plantations and work, because it takes the financial burden off of them, and it allows them to use those slaves to get more money to take care of themselves and what have you. And those slaves were allowed to keep some of the money. So what you have are slaves moving around. Where in places like South Carolina, you know, you couldn't leave the plantation. You have all these people, you may stay on that plantation your entire life and you may never know what the next town looks like because you are never allowed to leave. In Kentucky, the slaves were allowed to hire themselves out. So you have a little bit more movement of actual African Americans during this time period than you do in other places. All of this is during slavery. The way that these masters would treat their slaves was always a little bit better. Of course, there were instances, many instances, where it was just a horrible experience. But as I'm going to deviate back to, so to speak, this presentation as it relates to the children, you'll begin to see how all of this plays out as the people are coming out of slavery, going through Reconstruction, and then actually migrating to the West. I'm going to talk a little bit about Reconstruction and I'm going to come back to it. During Reconstruction in Kentucky, first of all, you have a state that is a slave state that never seceded from the Union. And so when the president said, you know, all these slaves are free, it didn't apply to them because he was talking about the Confederate states. And Kentucky did not secede from the Union. And then, so during the war, it created a major problem because you have the Union soldiers there attracting and pulling the slaves off the plantation. Lincoln basically saying, if you enlist, you know, you will automatically get your freedom, and if your family comes, we can secure that your family will be free also. So you have a situation which is really kind of crazy as a slave state, because it was not a full Confederate contingency of people that were fighting the Union. No, you got Union and the Confederates fighting right there within the state. Okay, so what this does, it provides an opportunity for slaves to leave the plantation. So many of them leave and take refuge in the Union camps and secure their freedom. So then after emancipation is set, the slaves that that were loyal to the Union, so to speak, as far as Kentucky was concerned, were still slaves. And the ones that were a part of the Confederacy, so to speak, they were set free, because that's what it said. So internally in the state, there was a unique situation going on. And it was almost the reverse of what was actually happening before slavery. Now you have the KKK coming into existence, the Night Riders, all of these people that are wanting to now control these former slaves. And so they wanted to control their movement. They didn't want them to gather together in large groups because of a fear of uprising. So during Reconstruction in Kentucky, it was absolutely havoc. It was just, I say it was fear. Fear was rampant, not only for the whites, but also for the African Americans. Imagine you have been a slave your entire life on this particular plantation. Now your master has to tell you you're free. Okay, I don't necessarily have a problem with you. But now he has to, by law, start to pay me because slavery is over. And if I was a slave on a plantation where I didn't really have a great relationship with my master, he's got to tell me I'm free, and maybe he beat me yesterday. Or maybe he sold my family away from me, or he sold my spouse away from me a couple of days ago or a week ago or whatever. He's going to be afraid because he doesn't know what I'm going to do. He doesn't know how I'm going to react. You know, just because someone said you're emancipated, that didn't mean everybody's mind was just cleared out and now we've got a new program playing. No, it took time for the bugs to work itself out. And so the federal government said, okay, now we have emancipated the slaves. We've really got to do something to get them acclimated into the culture. So what they did was they created, and most people don't even know about this bureau, it was called the Freedmen's Bureau. And it was set up so that they could provide education to these former slaves where education was denied. Now in Kentucky, they never really had a law on the books that said that slaves could not learn to read and write, but they did not encourage it. So they wanted to provide schools so that they could formally educate children. And so they created what was called the Freedmen's Schools. They created a bank called the Freedmen's Savings Bank, so that African Americans, if they had extra money, they could put it into the savings account and hopefully be able to go to the bank and get loans and what have you. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up to make sure that they had proper clothing and food. And one of their major jobs was to negotiate the contracts with their former masters. Okay, so we got to ensure that these slaves are no longer slaves and that they get paid. And it's against the law for them to work as slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau representatives come in to the plantation owners and they negotiate the contract, so to speak, with these former masters. And on average, it was about $12 that they were paid a month. Now I'm no longer a slave for this master. I'm working with him. They had a confiscation act also of property and goods and stuff that they had confiscated during the war. All of that was supposed to be given to these former slaves. Now, imagine that. The war is over, I come back to my plantation. Yeah, they pardoned all of these soldiers, and so they come back to their plantation or their farms, and maybe they have been destroyed. Now all of their property and everything that has been confiscated, now we're supposed to give it to the blacks. I don't think so. Many of them said, I don't think so. And so they ended up creating a situation that was so absolutely bizarre when I think about it, that it created the perfect environment for slaves to leave. You would think, okay, we're emancipated, everything's going to be, now, the mindset of those that were slaves as well as those that were slave owners, it did not just change. And the African Americans really, many of them wanted to stay right where they were, because, you know, if I lived in Lexington or Georgetown and on a plantation out in the country, maybe I never got a chance to go to Lexington. I know, I hear about it, but I've never been over there. Or maybe I lived in Lexington and I've heard about Georgetown or Paris, but I've never been over there. They said if you take this road, it will lead you to Paris. Well, I don't know what's between here and there. And I'm afraid because, you know what, people are patrolling, trying to control our movement, trying to control us completely. So fear is the basis of what gave rise to the KKK and just all of the havoc and the lynchings and the brutality that was going on. And slavery, emancipation brought about cruelty and brutality more so in Kentucky than any other southern state, which is almost the reverse of what was happening, before emancipation and during the war. And so here's the climate. Do we want to stay here? No, we didn't have a choice before. Now we have a choice. But how do we exercise that choice? I don't know where Plainville is. I've heard about it. I don't know where Waukeeny is. They say Waukeeny is a great place. I'd like to get over there, but I'm scared. I don't know. And how am I going to get over there? I have no transportation other than my 2 feet. So people were limited by the entire environment and the entire social and economic situation that was going on during Reconstruction. And so what happened was, out here in the West, there was a war going on out here. The Civil War was over. They were trying to reconstruct the South, but there were Indian wars going on right out here, and Fort Hays, major post for the Buffalo Soldiers, who were the first African-American men to officially serve in the military after the Civil War. After emancipation of these African-American men, women were not allowed to join, although we know one case in particular where a black woman impostered herself as a man and joined the 24th Infantry and served for 2 years before they found out that she was a woman. But now they say, okay, the military need has shifted. The war is over, but the military need is here in the West. Why? because we're trying to achieve manifest destiny from seas to shining seas and everything in between. We're forcing the Native Americans onto the reservations, and we want to open this land for anyone that wants to come. Not just our American Southerners and our Easterners. We're going to open it up to anybody. How many people know that Ellis is a Volga German community? Figured you would. DeMar, Kansas is a French Canadian. So you have all of these little communities popping up all over in the promised lands of Kansas. So people were migrating to the West. At this particular time, for African Americans, the West was obviously a great choice. But how in the world were they going to find out about it? How are they going to find out about all of this land that, well, I'm thinking I'm going to get some of the confiscated land. Oh, they changed the rules. Can't get that land anymore. Can I share crop? Oh, barely. Because these plantations are not large. So the catalysts were people like W.R. Hill, who was a town speculator out here, and he decided to come to Northwest Kansas after he helped people get settled in Wichita and Hutchinson. And he said, I'm gonna create a town and name it after myself, Hill City. But before he did that, he met an African-American homesteader who had been out here, and he convinced him to go into partnership with him. Imagine that, a black man and a white man going into partnership to create a town. Well, they could make money. If you wanted to homestead, you could file a claim on 160 acres and live there for 5 years, improve the land, and then after 5 years, and with a witness or two, because they had to believe you, so you had to have a witness or two, you go back and they give you the land pact, which is the first real deed to the land. Okay, so W.R. Hill met this black man, and they went to Topeka and met 5 black ministers, and they created the Nicodemus Town Company. And so that they could create an all-black town, plan it all out, and basically make money. I think probably, and I'm going to speculate when I say this, that the ministers probably had a motive that was beyond economics. I think they were looking at how can we provide a haven for the destitute African Americans that are in the South. And they said, okay, so where are we going to get these people from? They were from Kentucky, so they said, let's go back home. They went to the churches because of the Jim Crow laws. African Americans could not gather together in large groups. So they went to the churches and they promoted the town. And about 350 people said, we're out of here. I believe the sun sets in the west, and that's good enough for me. I'm out of here. So about 350 people ultimately got on trains. They did not walk. And the reason they got on trains was the Cincinnati Southern had just opened a spur from Cincinnati, Ohio, which is just about 80 miles north of Lexington, all the way down through the Bluegrass area to Tennessee. They opened that spur that spring. Okay, W.R. Hill and one of the ministers, Roundtree, they go to the churches because African Americans can gather together in large groups if they're in church. Many of those churches, though, they would still require a white to be present. But they went to the churches and they promoted the town, and they got on trains, and they came all the way to Ellis. Got off the train in Ellis, and then they had a 2-day walk over to Nicodemus. They were in the promised lands. They were on free soil. There had never been slavery here. They're out in the middle of nowhere. And they can become landowners. 160 acres? That's probably bigger than some of the, I know it was, some of the plantations, so to speak, that they lived on. So this became the draw. The land and homesteading and being able to be in an all-black community with a way of kind of sustaining themselves and governing themselves was very appealing to many that had the vision and the courage to leave their former homes, even though it was, they endured slavery there, to come to the West and start anew. About 350 people did. And then there were basically several groups of people that came, but 3 major groups that came. That group, there was a trickle of people that came in from the Topeka area, but primarily those were some of the founding fathers trying to get things situated and set. And then the first actual group that migrated out was from the Lexington, Georgetown area. And that was in September of 1877. Then the following, well, in the spring, which was several months later, they had the second group that actually came from the Georgetown area. And then a year later, which was in 1879, they had another group that came from Leavenworth. And it wasn't until I unraveled the genealogy that I understood the connection between that group that came in 1879 from Leavenworth. And basically, in short, those people had been, most of those people had been slaves in Kentucky, in Georgetown, and had been brought to Missouri with their former masters. And when emancipation came, they moved over across the river to Kansas, and then ultimately heard about Nicodemus, knew these people, because they were from the central bluegrass area, from the same general plantations, and ended up coming to Nicodemus. That's kind of it in a nutshell, but I'm going to now go into the children and why it's important to understand this first and second generation of children that are actually being born into freedom. I always say there's really one word that kind of says it all about what it was like before and after slavery, and that is the word choice. During slavery, there is no choice. You don't determine who you're going to sleep with, be married to. Of course, marriage were not legal. They would allow the slaves to cohabitate together if they wanted to, and they would allow them at times to jump the broom. Jumping the broom was an old African tradition that many of us do even to this day. I jumped the broom twice, and I jumped back over the broom twice. But it's a way that African Americans were allowed to be married, but during this time period, if you wanted to be married, you had to get permission from your master. So maybe you could or maybe you couldn't actually cohabitate or marry someone that you wanted to. You have no choice. Did the women have any choice over who their husband's going to be? No. And even if they did and they were allowed to, did they have any control over their children? No. They didn't own themselves, they didn't own their husbands, they didn't own their children. Although they had all of the physical and biological and emotional and spiritual connection with their children and their spouses, legally they had no right to them whatsoever. And so as slavery is happening, and I'm a woman, and maybe the master does allow me to cohabitate and maybe even jump the broom with my husband, say Barry, I'll use his name, that's my ex-husband. And then I have children, and I have a little girl. Now I have a sister that's named Cheryl. Now, one of the things that the slaves would do to keep track of their children, especially if there was a potential, which was always there, of them being sold away, is they would name their daughters after their sisters if they could. And if they had sons, they named their sons after their brothers, if they could. If they had the choice. That movie, which was the sequel to Roots, Queen, in that movie, and Halle Berry plays the main character, her mother is a slave woman, and her father is the master. So when she has the baby, she decides that she's going to name the little girl Queen. But when the master is writing the name in the logbook, he writes, "No, I don't like Princess. I'm going to call her Queen." Who had the choice? He did. So you don't even have a choice in how you're going to name your children. So as much as they possibly could exercise a choice in terms of naming their children, that's what they typically would do. The first generation of Africans that were born in America, many of them took on the name of, if it was a woman, America. If you were a male, Americus. And that name was used quite a bit, not only in the African community, African American community, but also in the white community. And that denotes that you were born here in America. So the first and second generation that came from Africa, you would see a lot of those names. And those names kind of get passed on also. So I don't have any control over my husband, I don't have any control over my children, I can't name them when I want to name them. I have no control over rearing them. So if I'm on a plantation and there's several young children, usually the infirmed and the older women were the ones that took care of them, the young ones, until they were about 6. And then once they were about 6, then they could actually be useful in the house or maybe even the fields by taking buckets of water, or if they're in the house fanning and playing with the children and being little servants to the master's kids. But once they turned about 12, then they were considered adults more or less, and they got relegated to doing laborious tasks just like the adults. So it's the infirmed and older women that are taking care of these children. And this gives rise to what we as African American women feel very proud of, but it has gotten to the point where this word has been used and watered down to the point where it's kind of frustrating for us, but you know, how many of you have heard and or used the word sister? Hey sister. That, for African American women, it is our sisterhood, and the sisterhood came out of these women, the infirm women and the women that had to take care of these children, and it's a network of women that take care of other women and children. That's the sisterhood for us. So if a young girl, like when I was growing up, if a young girl got pregnant, she could always rely on the sisterhood. Who was the sisterhood? Her aunts, her mom, her grandmothers, and other women that they considered a part of his sisterhood, which were aunts and grandmas, not even connected biologically. That was what the sisterhood was. And this is where it came from. So these children were being reared before they actually went into full-fledged work by the sisterhood, so to speak. The fears of the children. They were afraid that their parents, of course, they lived with them in the slave quarters. This is my mom, this is my dad. I'm afraid they're going to sell my parents away from me, or their own siblings. They were scared of seeing others being beat or being beaten. They were always fearful of not having enough food. You know, and that is a situation that is still very prevalent in the world today, even here in America, where we have children that are not being nourished properly, or even have adequate clothing. And if the masters would keep their parents from them, for example, when Queen was a certain age, the master, I think she was about 4 or 5, the master took her and put her in the house, and she worked in the house. So she grows up in the house, and she sees her mom every once in a while working in the fields or whatever. And there's a scene in there where she's on a buggy with her white sister, and they're going to town, and she passes by her mom, who is living in the quarters. And you can just see the emotional torment that the mother is having. And of course they were, if you were a girl, you were always afraid of being sexually taken advantage of. You had no control over yourself whatsoever. Of course, the children as slaves, as you can see, they were always afraid that the KKK, the Night Riders, were going to come in and disrupt whatever life that they thought they could possibly have. These are the fears of the mothers. They had no control over selecting their partners. They were fearful of being taken advantage of sexually, whether they were the favorite of the master or not. If you saw 12 Years a Slave, you saw the relationship between the master and the slave woman that was his favorite, and how his wife took it out on her. So, you know, this whole concept, well, if you was in the house, you know, and you were the favorite of the master, you know, you had it better. That's something that we as African Americans always are disputing. Well, you had it worse if you were a field slave versus a house slave. No, and there's no real advantage in either side of that coin. Of course, they were always being fearful of being beaten and used as a scapegoat by their masters and or their mistresses. They wanted to, the white woman didn't have any control either. She didn't have any control over her husband. Many situations where you have a plantation in a huge house and the mistress cannot stand the fact that his favorite female slave is living in the house. Can you imagine that? he's down, he's down the hallway, and he finally comes in, and you know he's been with his slave. Can you imagine the frustration of a white woman? It was just unbelievable. The atrocities were just unbelievable. Of course, they didn't have any control over naming their children's working arrangements. Of course, they were always afraid that the children would be sold away from them, so they tried to make sure that the kids learned how to be under control. And don't be out of control. Do what you're told to do. Don't be a rebel, because you're going to get sold and or beaten. Of course, they were afraid that when the master died, what was going to happen to them? You know, maybe part of us would go with this part of the estate, and maybe some of us were going to be sold. And there was many situations where they looked, if they were in a bad economic situation, they would, well, how many people have had an opportunity to see, I know it wasn't on the theater here, but Harriet. Yeah, the story of Harriet Tubman. Do you guys know the story of Harriet Tubman? Okay, you can buy it at Walmart. It is worth buying. It is absolutely a phenomenal movie. The cinematography is great. The storyline is unbelievable. And you learn so much by watching that film about what it was like, the dynamics of the culture at that time. There is a situation where the 5 or 6 of the slaves, well, the master dies, and they've got to sell some of the slaves to keep the farm. So if your property, you're up to be sold any time. Of course, they were afraid that your children would be beaten and or sexually taken advantage of. Okay, that was what was happening before emancipation, during slavery. And okay, this was what was going on during Reconstruction and emancipation. Of course, the increased fear and brutality were rampant. With emancipation came freedom to choose, although Jim Crow laws were imposed and fear was the norm for whites, and it actually increased in blacks. Family ties, families tried to reunite and or they split. If I knew some of my children got sold away from me, or my parents or siblings, I want to find them after emancipation. I want to see where they are. I heard that, you know, my sister moved to Waukene. So I want to see if I can go over to that plantation and see if I can find my sister. So people were moving and trying to reconnect with their families. Of course, the movement of African Americans at this time caused fear, confusion, and dislocation of individuals as well as families. Families divided, they were divided along the color lines. That's what happened within the African American culture. Again, if you watch that movie, Queen, she is a product of her slave mother and her master father. After emancipation, she has no place to go. She's being shunned by the slaves because she's a mixed blood, and she is not a part of their family. The whites, you know, she's a slave. So she has no place to go. That caused a split in the African American community along the color lines. And if you were light, you know, as a kid, this is one of the things that we learned. If you're white, you're all right. Or if you're light, you're all right. If you're brown, you can stick around, but if you are black, you've got to get back. That was a little saying that we said when we were kids. And what that did was just perpetuate this division along the color lines. And I can assure you, in my family, they're one extreme to the other. My oldest brother is dark as night. Yes, we have the same parents, but I and my one of my brothers, we're the lighter ones. The texture of the hair changes from one child to the next. So if your hair is long and straight, mine's only straight because I pressed it out this morning. I didn't get the end, so they're a little nappy. So if you had white features and you had light complexion, you were more acceptable, so to speak, in the white culture, and blacks would shun you. So African American culture, there is that division along the lines of color. Many of the women became heads of their own household. Imagine that. My husband that I jumped the broom with decided that he wanted to be with his former slave family that lived in Hayes. He doesn't want to be with me. He has a choice. Some of those men said, I'm not going to be with any families. I'm just going to take my freedom and I'm just going to do what I want to do with it. I don't want an allegiance to any family. So women were heads of their own household. That's why African American women are strong. We can't help it. We're a product of that slave experience. We had to be strong. We had to be the heads of the household. We had to be the ones that made the decision. But let me tell you, I'm 67 years old and I'm tired. I'm about ready to jump the broom again. And of course, they fear that their children would be taken advantage of.
You flipped your slide when you...
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounded like I already said that. Families with multiple children, multiple parents. And I'll start giving you some examples of how this played out in Nicodemus. Freedom. When freedom came, they have a choice. Who their partners are going to be, what they're going to name their children. They don't have to fear that the children are going to be sold away. And the women were allowed to determine how they were going to raise their children and how and what kind of work they were going to let their children do. And the women wanted to make sure, they were providing education and religion to their free children. See the difference? In slavery, they don't have no choice over anything. After emancipation, they do have a choice. Of course, I've told you about how Nicodemus came into being and the migration to Kansas, the free soils, so they could really experience real freedom. They could not experience and express freedom in their former home where they were slaves. So when they came to the West, this is free soils, there was never slavery here. They get land and they start their own town and they govern themselves. And in order to go, it cost you $5 to join the Nicodemus Town Company. That assured you that W.R. Hilton were going to actually accompany you to the West and help you to get homestead papers, which that didn't really play out the way they thought either. Who were these people? Some of these people that came with their adult children. Some of them came with their little children. Some of them, like my great-grandmother was pregnant at the time, and she came with child in her stomach. And what did these mothers actually think and feel? Because the first time their children are born free. If I had children during slavery, I knew I was giving birth to a child that was going to endure slavery. And many of them would kill their children. Now, you would say, well, why would they want to do that? They would rather kill their children than to see them suffer and be sold and have to deal with the institution of slavery. These children are born on free soil. Not in a slave state, but in a free state, and they're born free. They were excited. The first baby born in Nicodemus was the boy that's standing in the center there. His name was Henry. Now his mom and dad is Emma and Charles. Now his brother that's standing next to him is named Charles after his dad. Henry was named Henry after his uncle. Here's an example of the slave family still exercising this way of trying to keep track of your children by naming your children after your siblings. And so he's named after his uncle who came with the family in 1877. Charles, his brother, is named after his dad. He is not necessarily a junior. Of course, people would say juniors, but technically speaking, he is named after his dad, and he is my grandfather. All right, some of the photographs that you're going to see in the rest of these slides are just some of the photographs of these children that were born free for the first time and are being reared by their parents. And many of these photographs, it's an example of what we have in our collection. So I'll go through them and then I'll get on to a little bit more, and then I don't know how much time I've got, but
My students have to leave in around 7-8 minutes, but you're free to keep going because other people don't have to leave.
okay. I'll go through these photographs so you guys can just see the kinds of photographs that we have in our collection at the Nicodemus Historical Society. We have thousands of photographs. It's unbelievable. I don't know how it happened, but it just did. Some of them are before the turn of the century, some of them are after them. And in 2010, the Nicodemus Historical Society, 2012, we published this book of the Children of the Promised Land. And I wanted to make sure that people had an opportunity to see the kinds of photographs that we had in our collection. So I started out with children, and this book has about 210 photographs of the children, from infants all the way to teenagers. These people were proud of their children. So they made sure that they got photographs of them. And many of these photographs are studio photographs, but obviously this is not a studio photograph. That may be a studio photograph. And then there were traveling photographers, and so we do have some photographs of family members and children that were taken by traveling photographers. But this gives you an idea of the type of photographs that we have and the actual depiction of these children, as well as the concept of these parents being very proud to have their children's pictures taken. Obviously, this is not studio. These are my great aunts. Those are some country bumpkin kids. That little girl with her head turned completely around. I think that's my sister Cheryl. And the little girl with her hand in her mouth, I know that's me. My brother, the tall one, is the oldest one. He lives in Belgium right now. My other brother, he's deceased. And my oldest sister, who's not on this picture, she was actually in the hospital here in Hayes because she had fallen into a tub of hot water. And the Tholen family that lived not too far from here allowed my parents to stay with them. And Hayes was very willing and very supportive of trying to help my parents take care of medical bills for my sister. But there we are in Nicodemus, Country Bumpkins. There we are in California. I grew up in Pasadena, California. So my parents left when I was about 4 years old. That's me with the dress hanging out. So we moved to California, and that's where I grew up, and that's all of us. We come to Nicodemus every summer. Obviously, studio shots. This is my great-grandmother, America Bates, and her 2 daughters.
Is that a hair bow?
Yes, big hair bow. That was fashionable at the time. Now, this is my other great-grandmother and her 4 daughters. 2 of the daughters actually married 2 Sayers brothers. One of my favorite photographs in the collection.
2 Sayers brothers as in?
The Sayers family came down from DeWitt, Nebraska, and populated Nicodemus, and the second county attorney was W.L. Sayers. And so Ed Sayers, one of the brothers, is the great-grandfather to Gail Sayers. This is my cousin.
You might have to tell these young people who you can't say.
Okay. Who said schools weren't integrated here in Kansas? This is a Fairview School, which was one of the schools in Nicodemus. Nicodemus had 3 schools in the area. This one was 2 miles north of Nicodemus. And I'll end with that one. That's me when I was about 5 years old. I I just want to read this, and I think this kind of captures it all, and then we can open it up for questions and answers. In the fall of 1877, young, pregnant Emma Johnson Williams traveled to an unknown land. With her siblings and parents, she journeyed to Nicodemus, Kansas, far beyond the horizon of what was familiar and known to her and her parents as former slaves on the plantation of Vice President Richard M. Johnson of Georgetown, Kentucky. Vice President Richard M. Johnson was the vice president under Van Buren. Emma traveled without her husband, Charles, who promised to meet her at Nicodemus in the spring. To know her child would be born on the free soils must have replaced any apprehension she felt facing the unknown. When she gave birth to the first child of Nicodemus, a child born to experience freedom, shouts of joy must have rung across the barren, windswept Kansas prairie. Angels of heaven must have sung a song of joy while the spirits of the ancestors celebrated with great jubilee. The birth of a strong boy during the harsh fall of 1877 was a sign of the strong will required to face the challenges and hardships ahead. As a new mother and pioneer woman, Emma met those challenges and hardships with raw tenacity and a strong faith in God. She had survived childbirth and was proud to give birth to the firstborn child of Nicodemus. God himself must have been pleased when those first cries rang out, letting heaven and earth know this tiny baby was one of the first generations of African Americans children born free on the free soils of Kansas. The firstborn was named Henry after his uncle. On that late October day when little Henry took his first breath, burning buffalo chips used as fuel, dirt from the dugout where he was born, and his mother's warm skin were his first sense. Light that flickered from a nearby candle or lamp was the first light to his tiny eyes. Beyond the sounds of his loving voices, his ears must have heard the cry of a lone wolf, the sweet song of a Kansas meadowlark, the cooing of a dove, or perhaps the screech of a red-tailed hawk. Kansas welcomed him as he welcomed his first breath into this new world. And that is how it began on October the 30th, 1877, on the free soils of Kansas. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes.
All of those photos, are they digitized? Are they available digitally?
They are available digitally, but you have to order them. We have thousands of them. And so if you're interested in any of the photographs, you either have to go to KU and look at the collection, or you come to Nicodemus and we have catalogs of the photographs. And you can look at them, and if you decide you want one, then we contact KU and then they go.
When is the Emancipation Celebration?
The last weekend in July.
Last weekend?
The last weekend, that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I think it's the 30th, 27th, 28th, or 9th, 30th. I don't have it in my head, but it's that last weekend in July. Yes.
Are you opening Ernest Days this summer?
Oh.
That was my next question, and I was trying not to
I'm not
ask two
answering
in a
that
row.
question.
Oh!
I'm trying, my niece is interested in actually purchasing it, so I'm trying to work out some things with her. I hope that we can get it open in April.
Oh, there's no barbecue like Ernest Days
Yeah,
barbecue.
yeah,
There just isn't.
yeah. If you call me, I can probably make arrangements. Yes.
I'm interested, I heard when I first moved to Hayes about 6 years ago that there was some talk about getting the trail between Ellis.
Yes,
and
yes.
Is that movement still afloat?
It is. I need to get with Ken Rogers, our state representative. He's 100% behind this. We are still doing stuff on the trail. Matter of fact, in May, the Memorial Day weekend, that Saturday, we're having a Chautauqua. And this year, it's all about the Ellis Trail. So the reenactments that we do on the trail, we're going to actually be doing under the big tent for the Chautauqua. But yeah, and if you want to actually get a brochure for the trail, you can just contact us.
Okay.
But we're in the process of trying to work with the state to get it designated as a historic trail.
Great, I hope that happens.
Oh, I think it will.
Good.
I was pretty successful at getting Nicodemus designated as a national park. I don't think this will be as hard. And I hope it isn't.
I don't know. I hope not to.
Yeah.
Will it just be like stops along the blacktop going up north?
No, it's not the blacktop. It's parallel to the blacktop, yeah.
But so in right of way or?
Oh, yeah, you
Or are
can
you having to
just-
get property owners?
Well, basically, the map shows you the route to take, and then on the map also, or the brochure, you can see the different places. For example, where Happy Hollow was.
Yeah.
Happy Hollow was where they spent the night. For years, I thought it was Sleepy Hollow. There's a
There's some
sign.
legend.
There's a sign, and there is a place called Sleepy Hollow, about 6 or 8, right over the Aryan Hills, right down into this area that is called Sleepy Hollow. For years, I thought that was it. Until we were doing research about 3 or 4 years ago, and we were processing one of the cousins' collection, and there's a letter from Abram Hall, who was the census taker. He and his partner came in 1878. There's a letter in there from him to Catherine Henry, and in there, he's describing the trip from Leavenworth and how they got off the train, and then how they got on the wagons, he and his partner. This was a separate little group. And as they're coming, he's got a satchel on top of the wagon, and it falls off, and he doesn't realize it's gone until they cross the Saline River. And when they crossed the Saline River, they had rested there, and they kept going. He realized that his satchel had fallen off, so he wanted to go back. And he says in the letter, "We'll meet you at Happy Hollow, which is half of the remaining distance." So once we identified where it was, it all made sense. It's like, oh God, I thought it was Sleepy Hollow. No, it was Happy Hollow. It was called Happy Hollow. So there's probably about 4 or 5 places around on the route that we identify, and some of the visual landmarks that they use to guide themselves along the trail to Nicodemus. The Walsh's homestead, Henry Walsh just died, I think it was in September. He was 105. His son, having a senior moment. Anyway, his son, Walsh, last name Walsh, he lives on the farm about a mile from there, but his cousin lives across the road from the homestead. And that's where, in their history, they have it recorded that the people of Nicodemus would cross their property. Not just the people of Nicodemus, it became so popular that there was literally a trail across their property. And they would give people water and that kind of thing. So Leroy Walsh always is available to talk, and we have a historic photograph. When his dad died in September, he was always, Mr. Walsh Henry was always out there when we had the tours, and the kids would see them. We do things with the 4th graders. And when he died, they set up a memorial, and it was his request to set up a memorial in his name for the Nicodemus Historical Society. So we have enough money to buy a sign that's going to go on the property, and the guy that actually owns it, who is Leroy's cousin, he's always out there with them when they're talking to the kids and all. So we're going to get the sign done and put up on the property. We're going to continue to move forward, whether it's designated or not. I mean, we're going to let people know where it is, and you can take. It's a beautiful. To me, it's absolutely gorgeous to go that way. Even if you take the blacktop, it's just beautiful. Going down into the Saline Valley and then going up, and it kind of flattens out there where Palco is, more or less. And then you're going down into the Solomon Valley. And then south of DeMar, there's a big mound that's called School Mound. And from there you can see Nicodemus, and that's where Willie Ann Hickman said she saw Nicodemus for the first time. She said she looked with all her eyes and she still couldn't see it. And her husband said, see the smoke's coming out of the ground over there? That's where Nicodemus is. So, and she said when she got on the town site, she sat down and cried. Now, they were a part of the second group that came in 1878, and many of those people literally turned around and moved to Ellis. So the black contingency of the people that lived in Ellis were a part of that second group that decided they wanted to go back. So they were the Neals, the Youngs, the Vinegars, those families that were over there. Of course, all of those people are gone, but those black people were a part of that second wave of people to Nicodemus.
they decide to go to Ellis?
It wasn't a decision to go to Ellis. Oh, you mean to move back to Ellis?
Yeah.
Because that's where the train was, that's where the activity was. Big North was the open prairie. So you got a city there, you got a town there, and that's where the railroad was. So, and at this time, you know, Hayes is about 10 years old. Hayes is just about 10 years old. So they wanted to move back to where the,
For the action.
yeah, where the action was. Yes, ma'am? Ask, oh, you better ask, because once I step down.
I know, and I hate to keep you standing, but.
That's all right.
But, so I'm gonna ask a librarian question. How are you processing all these wonderful materials that come in from families? And do you have grants that are helping you? Do you have volunteers? It just seems like a massive challenge,
You
because
need-
I know how our challenges are
You
here in
need-
our library.
You need to come to our little building, tiny building that's filled to bulging. We need to work on our building, we need to work on getting a new building. That's gonna be our new challenge. But you've heard of Past Perfect, the software?
Sure.
All our stuff is processed in Past Perfect. And we work for about, well, it's never ending, you know that. It's never ending. But we worked for about 7 years and have a young lady by the name of Cecilia Crockett, who lives in Topeka, but she comes down. She'll come down for a couple of months at a time, or we'll bring her down. And she's worked with me from the beginning of organizing it. And we started to officially organize it and put it into Past Perfect. Well, we had to organize it before we got to Past Perfect. And we had to literally organize all. And before we had the stuff in the museum and we were given this house for the museum, that stuff was in one of my bedrooms. That was just filled to the ceiling with boxes.
This sounds very familiar.
Yeah,
Jenny
and-
librarian.
My cousin said, you know, my grandmother's house, you know, I owned, that's Kim Thomas, who used to be the mayor in Stockton. She said, we're gonna give you this house. We're gonna give you the house and the land around it. Because her grandmother was one of the school teachers there, and she was probably, I would say, the second real historian in Nicodemus. And so she said, we're gonna give you the house. Well, it had been shut up for a number of years. After she died, they just shut the doors, literally locked the doors and walked away. So it took about a month just to clean out the house, and we went through everything because you don't want to get rid of anything. And what we found in her collection was absolutely phenomenal. As a matter of fact, that letter I was talking about, that was a part of her collection. But what we did was we had to organize it. We had photographs, and I started the Nicodemus Historical Society in 1988. Then in 1989, we got our 501c3 status, and I was doing newsletters every month, and I was publishing genealogies, getting information from, you know, and all of those people that are older, they're all gone now. Many of them, including my dad, who died just 2 years ago, I have tons of questions. You let somebody die, then you got tons of questions, and you can't even ask them. But we started collecting stuff from people. And the very first big collection we got was from my cousin, who was a part of the organizing body of us descendants. We wanted to have as much representative from the families as we could. So there were 5 of us representing 5 different families, although we are all related to one another. And so Gil, God bless his soul, he died about 3 years ago. He had a leak in his basement, and he had all of this stuff from our great aunt and his aunt. And he said, you know what, I don't want to destroy, I don't want this stuff destroyed, so, and I don't really want it. So we went in his basement and pulled out boxes and trunks, and our first collection were thousands of photographs, at least 1,000. Now, maybe it wasn't thousands, close to 1,000 photographs, historical photographs, many of the ones that you've seen in here. The 3 little girls that I said were my aunts. Okay, that was, so here we had all of these photographs, and I said to myself, it's not gonna do us any good to take them out of your basement and to put them in this museum over here, because we don't have any, even though we have the room to house it, these are precious, and I don't want there to be a fire and we lose this stuff. I'm still scared of that to this day, but all of our stuff is at KU now, except for stuff that we are processing. And all of the private collection stuff was processed first. And so we scanned photographs, and it took about 7 years. And like right now, we have we're working with a lady that's a cousin, that's working through the Department of Labor, their senior workforce. We just hired her 2 weeks ago. Thank you, Jesus. Because we have no money to pay anybody. But we do get grant monies. I apply for a grant from the Hampson Foundation, and they give us money every year. And when we were in the process of trying to do some things to the building, they gave us money to help do that. But right now, we need some serious money because we need a new building. We've outgrown that. We're trying to raise money to put some siding on there. We're in the process of redoing the porch just as soon as we can. Do some work on the porch, but we are trying to raise money to do some sidings. But we have probably the most extensive, and I can say this very confidently, the most extensive historical photograph collection of a group of African Americans from one place than anybody in the United States. And I know you're familiar with the Schomburg in New York. They were interested in our collection. Can you donate? No. The reason we selected KU was because there was a document by our great cousin Lula Craig, who was the first real historian. She kept track of everything. She interviewed people. I can tell you some of the stories that I tell is as a result of her document. The reason I know that the slaves of Tom Johnson and his family and some others, the Kirtleys and what have you, were slaves of Vice President Richard M. Johnson is because of Lula. She interviewed her grandfather, who was my great-great-great-grandfather, who was owned by Richard M. Johnson's daughter by his black slave, Julia Chin. And I've been to the plantation, so to speak. They used to have the Colored People's Fair there. And there's a graveyard right there on the property with Imogene and Adeline and Julia Chin, his wife and his children that are buried. Of course, he's not buried there. He's buried in Frankfurt. But on his daughter's plantation is where his wife and the two daughters are buried. And so I've been there, and that's neat. And we shot documentary footage there. I'm trying to see if I can get John Mann, who actually did the documentary, to resurrect and produce the footage that really relates to that. When we were there, we were taking footage, but we didn't use that particular footage. And the piece that we show at the visitor center is is about 20 minutes of his documentary, but there's people being interviewed and historical photographs and all. But, and then in 2012, I think it was, the Johnsons, the white Johnsons, Richard M. Johnson's siblings and all, they, descendants of them, they gave a family reunion. They do a family reunion like every 2 or 3 years. And that year they decided to invite the descendants of the slaves of their family, because they were big slave owners. I mean, they were, part of the organizing body that helped to establish Kentucky. And of course they were aristocracy. And so they had the means. But what was interesting is Richard decided that he was going to marry a slave, and did. And he didn't care what anybody thought about it. And there's a young lady, I think her name is Hull, don't quote me on this, that's writing a book. She's a descendant of Richard M. Johnson's daughter, I'm not sure which one. I met one of his great nieces who used to work for the Washington Post, and this was several years ago, and she said she was writing a book about Richard M. Johnson marrying his slave. I have his biography that was written, I think, about 1909. I forget who actually put it all together. But in there, it talks about him marrying Julia Chin. And in Lula Craig's document, there's a story in there from my great-grandfather that was the, let me get out of this. Anyway, that was his Tom Johnson, who was Emma, who had the first baby born, my great-grandmother. Tom and her and the family were owned by Vice President Richard M. Johnson. I know that because of Lula Craig's document. I didn't know that Lula Craig's grandfather, John Samuels, was my great-great-great-grandfather until I was having a conversation with my grandmother, and she broke the genealogy down, and she said, see this photograph right here? She said, that's your great-great-great-grandfather. I was like, what? And then I could put the connection genealogically together with all of these families. It was like a big puzzle that had pieces over here, and then slowly it was like, oh, okay. So the group that came from Lexington, they were organized by John Samuels, my great-great-great-grandfather, who was owned by Vice President Richard M. Johnson's daughter, but his wife was owned by a Pence, and he was owned by a Pence. So when his wife's master died, the mistress decided she was moving the family to Weston, Missouri. So she goes to Weston, and in Lula Craig's document, he talks about how he was given a pass so that he could go down to the Pike and see his family leave. And his master, Daniel Pence, who was married to Imogene, who was Richard M. Johnson's daughter, said, I'm going to find someone I can sell you to in the Weston, Missouri area. And he did. A couple of years later, he sold him to a guy by the name of Henderson, and they lived in the same general area. And after emancipation, they had been going to the Christian church there, and after emancipation, Oliver Still, who was the minister there, ordained John as a Christian minister. They decide they're going to move across the river after emancipation, I don't know how many years. They move across the river to Leavenworth. And that's when they overhear this guy by the name of John Niles, who was the first African American to really push Congress for reparations. Got to start right there in Nicodemus. John Niles was in Leavenworth soliciting supplies because people were destitute out here. So he was there soliciting supplies, and at the AME church there, they had a meeting that night where they were going to be taking the supplies that they had collected to Nicodemus. And before the meeting, John Niles was at a restaurant, and Abram Hall and Edward P. McCabe happened to get off the train and be eating, and they were on their way to the Hodgman colony area in Hodgman County. And they overheard the conversation that Niles was having, so they decided they're not going to go there, they're going to go to Nicodemus. So John Niles, being in Leavenworth, knows about Nicodemus, knows that Tom, my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side, who was owned by Richard M. Johnson, was in Nicodemus. So there's a connection with those people that came geographically. They knew each other.
It really was a puzzle.
It was. I was like, why? It was always, the question for me early on was, why was there a group that came from Leavenworth? And they did not come by train, they came by prairie schooners to Nicodemus.
I'm so glad you have the relationship with KU. I worked there for years. I came first to Nicodemus on the Whirlwind Wheat
Yes,
State Tour
you know
in
what, I was saying to
2005.
myself, you're looking familiar. I don't forget faces.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I worked with Deborah Dandridge.
Oh, yeah, and we're still
Sherry
working with her.
Williams and- Yeah.
I've got about, believe it or not, I've got about, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, we've got about 1,500 photographs that need to go down there right now. And these are photographs that the Nicodemus Historical Society has created from our events and different things over the years, from family reunions and births and deaths and marriages to events that we actually process. So, but all of our private collection photographs that have been donated, they're already down there. They are a priority. If we get photographs from family members, we process them and get those down there immediately. But we do have a catalog system. What we did was, with all of the ones that are in the private collection, we scan those. And so we have a catalog that says these are the photographs of this private collection. I think we have about 38 private collections. And then our archives, we actually print out a copy of the, I don't know what it's called, one of the sheets that tells what is in this particular
Finding
folder.
aid.
Yeah. We print out one of those, and so you can actually go online. And our ultimate goal is so that if we can get the right kind of space and get the right kind of funding, that when you come over and you want to look at the private collections, you can look at them on the computer. With the photographs, we have a lot of them that we generated that are not scanned in. What we did was we just Xerox copied them. You know, they all have numbers, but we Xerox copied them because with that many photographs, if I call down there to Deborah and say I need PC Calvin 102, or there's a photograph that has not been cataloged like we catalog them now, like that very first group of photographs that we had initially, they were not cataloged. We know what the photographs are because we have Xerox copies. But they have been cataloged into the KU system opposed to our system and then us giving them to them. But we have, and that was one of the things I just had a young lady that just started working with us, Melvia, do just last week. I said, I think we've got about 20 books or so that are, you know, about 3-inch, three-ring binders. We got about 20 of them, and they're just filled with Xerox copies of the photographs. So, and they're done according to the event. If it's homecoming photographs, or if it's a wedding, or, you know, Boris White's 100th birthday celebration or whatever. So they're all cataloged in like that, but they're Xerox copies. So we can actually go through and say, oh yeah, this is a great picture. I would like to see an electronic copy. We have the catalog number on the back, and we can call KU and they can easily find it. But one of the challenges is that they are always trying to get me to come down and to identify some of the older photographs where they don't have any identification of who they are. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, I knew one day this was going to happen, I just didn't know it was going to be this soon. I'm like of this generation that we're in the queue, you know, queue to die.
I know.
You know, my dad was 90 years. My dad was 90 years old, and there's only he was the oldest living Bates at that time. The next one, he's 83, and he's not doing very well right now. But I've drained their brains as much as I can. But let them die, then I've got 10 questions that I would like to resurrect them to answer.
Oh, it's so wonderful to have you here.
I
appreciate your time
I can't explain the ecstasy and the bliss that I feel as a descendant, and to be a steward of this history.
And
I mean,
what a passion you had, and to start the everything moving in 1988, and to
Yes.
then let the
yeah, well, you know, and everything, you know, I believe in God having a say in what happens, you know. Everything that I did prior to actually moving out, I developed the skills that help me to do what I'm doing. You know, it's amazing to me. I mean, I worked in research. I had a top secret clearance, and I worked on training programs for the military, analyzing testing data and all of that. And then I have a degree in education and psychology from Emporia. Never did, I always thought I wanted to open up hang my little sign out there that said, psychologist. I think I get enough of that anyway, naturally. But I worked for 2 huge companies. And they had what they called, at that time, this was back in the 70s, what they called matrix management. And you floated around, you did not, there was no such thing as just sitting in your cubicle. And so you're working on several different projects. You're relegated to work on specific projects because of the budget for that project, and you're included in it. But then you're writing proposals all the time. You're writing proposals and responding to RFPs constantly. So, you know, you're floating around the company. If you got 2 hours here, you know, you may be sent over here to do something. And working in a think tank like that was unbelievable. I was working with some of the best scientists in the United States. I don't know a thing about certain things, but I learned so much from them. And then I met a guy that was a graphic artist, I got laid off, and I started an interior design business. Why? I don't know, because I'm a frustrated artist, and I thought I wanted to do these super graphics. And so I started this business, and my business partner was Dewey Holloway, and he was one of 5 graphic artists for the Secret Service. He was a phenomenal artist, absolutely. I learned so much from him. And so when I started my business, we started doing these super graphics and all of that, and then I landed this big contract with this guy that had 12 beauty salons, and they were all like little mom and pop shops. None of them looked alike. I said, we need to give you a whole new design, a whole new consistent look, so we created these logos and all of that. So I got to get into graphics, graphic design. I mean, this book here, I mean, doing the brochures, all of that kind of stuff. So I learned all of these skills, and as this was happening, I landed a contract with the same guy, but he had a historic building that was a historic pub in Fairfax, Virginia, and they wanted to renovate it. And so because it was on the register of historic places, I had to go to the National Trust and find out what the rules and regs were for this historic place. Well, I could almost stand on the corner and throw a rock over to the National Trust office. So I was always over there, you know, and I learned a lot about historic preservation and all. And then my cousin Verl Schweitzer was coming to DC periodically, and when he would come, he would meet with the National Park Service and his good friend, who's dead now, Ira Hutchison, who was over historic black colleges. And I remember the first meeting I had with them, Verl said, you know, you're going to be the next in line. I'm like, yeah, I don't know about that. Because I wasn't even thinking about Nicodemus like that at that time. But Ira said, Angela, Nicodemus should be a National Historic Site. Of all the places that have been designated historic places that are African American, Nicodemus needs to be a national park. I said, okay, what does that really mean? He said, well, you know, you need to develop some, I was going to say curriculum, but it's on my mind. But you need to work with your senator so that they can develop a piece of legislation that they can put before Congress. I, in my other job, was always looking at legislation that related to the military. So I was familiar with what actual legislation looked like, but I got an opportunity to really put what I learned to the test when I said, okay. So then when I moved out here and I started our historical society before I left Denver, I started it in 1988, I moved here in 1990, and it was on in Clackamas from there. I was like, okay. And it never occurred to me, not one time, it never crossed my mind that we were not going to be a national park. Okay, we're going to go for the national parks designation, and okay, this is what we got to do. So we're going to have these meetings. We're going to get the Park Service. Okay, I wrote Senator Doe, and he said, absolutely, let's go for it. Yay. He had eaten at Ernestine's, and that's all that he knew.
Oh, such a wonderful story.
It is, isn't it? I am just, and I'm elated to be a part of it. I'm blessed, and I'm so grateful that I was born at this particular time within this family.
And that you're willing to take the risk, though,
Well,
to do this. I mean,
well, you know, I don't
that's-
even see it as a risk.
Yeah.
I don't even see it as a risk. When I look at slavery
Yeah,
and what they had to endure, I haven't spent one day in chattel slavery.
sure.
I can get on air-conditioned airplanes and buses and trains and what have you. I can eat the best food. I can wear the best clothes. No one's telling me what to do. They endured slavery. And their story is worth being told. And they talk to me all the time. They keep the whip at my heels.
Major life commitment.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the better word.
And when I was young, because we went to California and I grew up there, I always had a longing. And I was like, why did you guys leave? You left all of the, well, not all of the family, but you left the family here. But there was a whole contingent of Nicodemus folks in Los Angeles that we dealt with all the time. But it was like, I love Nicodemus. It's country. Everybody had horses, pigs, cows, and chickens, and pumping the water and taking baths and, you know, after somebody else. That was fun. So I was primed even then. I had this passion. My brother and I, who was a Buffalo soldier who's now deceased, he and I were the country bumpkins. We couldn't get enough of Nicodemus.
And now you've got the tiny house project.
Yeah.
going.
And Johnella is in charge of that. I always have to make that distinction. Because I'm not in charge of any tiny houses. I'm not on the township board. I am running the historical
Yeah.
society and working with the Park Service.
Yeah,
Yeah, but it's exciting.
it is.
And at times it's kind of frightening because I know that, you know, there's less time in front of us than we have behind us. And so I'm always thinking, okay, I need to do this, I need to do this. And people say, well, what's gonna happen when you go? I don't know, you have to ask God, or if you're around, you have to tell me. I don't know, but I'm gonna do what I can do to make sure that their history is preserved and interpreted. And sometimes I'm very boisterous and adamant about our position. And it may not necessarily coincide with what the Park Service wants or wants to even hear at times. I don't care. I'm like Richard M. Johnson. I don't care what they think. This is my family. You know, this is our story. Don't walk around in our family with your dirty shoes. This is our family, so it's our story. We want to be able to help tell it. So, but anyway, I can keep going. I so appreciate you guys having me back over here. I mean, I know the last time I talked about some of these same things, but this presentation about the children really puts a lot of it in perspective. I mean,
This is wonderful. The photos
you know,
are
I
so
forgot to tell this, and I will share this with you all. There was here's an example of people changing their names. There was a cousin that was pregnant at the time of emancipation by her master. All of her children were by her master. They all had the last name of Wallingford. And when emancipation came, of course, the war was over, but she was pregnant. She named her last child Nettie Craig. And the Craig was not her name at the time, which was Turner, but that was her first slave name. And so she named her daughter, and if you look at the 1880 census or whatever, you'll see all these children living in the household. And here's this strange name, Craig. And your first thought is, who is that child? Oh, it must have been somebody that was adopted. No. This is her exercising her right to name her child, not after her slave master, who was the father of her, but it was her way of saying, hey, I've got a choice, and I'm going to exercise that choice. And that happened quite a bit. People changed their names. That aspect of the Reconstruction and that era hasn't really been uncovered and put on the surface there. And I think that that's what we as a nation need to do. We keep our head in the ground about slavery, and it's a travesty because we're just denying, and this is what I say, how many of you all own slaves? You don't own any, and I haven't spent one day in chattel slavery. So we can start right there. You don't have to feel guilty, and I really don't have to be mad. Now, I can be mad at some other things, but I don't have to be mad because I'm a slave. So we need to start there. I can't hold you accountable for what your forefathers did. We need to start there. So we don't have to, you know, feel like, I don't know what to say to those people. Should I call them colored, Negro, black, African American? You know, we need to open the dialogue so that people can, we're all people, we're all human beings. Isn't that why we had emancipation?
Well, I think it also points out the whole notion of 6 degrees of separation.
Yes.
Because I grew up in Topeka,
Uh-huh.
and, you know, there's all kinds of connections. We're all connected
Yes.
in some way.
Yes.
We have
Yes.
similarities, we know the same people.
Yes.
Or we worked in the same circles, you
Yes.
know. And until I moved out here, I didn't know about my friends
Mhm.
in Topeka, their connection to Nicodemus, until I learned more
And
about
who was that?
Nicodemus. Well, the Cushionberries and
Oh, yeah.
people like that stuff, and I mean, movers and shakers, people involved.
And the
in doing
Cushionberries
things.
were
But
right
we
there.
saw it as
Yeah.
part of Brown,
Oh, yeah.
versus Board of
Yeah.
Education, and then you're not knowing what
And
is.
that's another one of Deborah Dandridge's passions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, she worked on
But, you know, it's just like us, you asked who knows that, you know, Ellis was part of a Volga German peace, that Volga could be. It's like, when we can go anywhere in the world and find people who are connected
Yes.
to the Volga German migration, and the same is true
Yes.
of this.
We are really one race.
Right.
We all are human beings with a spirit. We can't help the bodies that we have, but this is just a vehicle to, you know, move around in this dimension. Okay, I'm not going to go there, but we've got to realize that all of the stuff that has happened socially is just a way of human beings being. And slavery for African Americans to be enslaved was a travesty, but slavery just didn't begin with African Americans.
And it still goes on.
And it still goes on. It's an ugly institution, no matter who is party to it. But we need to be able to talk about this as a part of American history. We don't talk about it. We're afraid to talk about it. Blacks get upset. And you know what? I'm the first one to say, if you had spent one day in slavery, would you not want to be remembered? You are standing on your forefathers and your ancestors' experience. And you're standing there because they endured it. You didn't. You have the privilege to be free. You know, let's be able to honor them. And it's unfortunate, and I can say this to blacks because I'm black. I can say, you know, we're our worst enemies. We don't want to know about African American history. I can go out to the public libraries and speak all over the nation. You would think the place would just be crowded with African Americans. Nope. We've been taught. It's not relevant, it's not significant, it's embarrassing, because that's how I felt growing up. I don't have anything to do with that. No. Oh my God. I could talk about slavery all the time and never thought I would ever want to talk about it. But I always wanted to talk about Nicodemus. And then once I came here and started really digging and having to go back and say, now, these people that just didn't drop out of the sky in 1870, who were these people? I'm related to them. Who were they? Now I can talk about them. I hear them, you know, I can tell their stories. And I know that if they're on the other side and can hear, I know they're pleased. Same thing when we had the reunion with the whites at the Johnsons. I mean, at the end, we all took photographs on the steps of Ward Hall, which was Vice President Richard M. Johnson's niece's plantation. Beautiful antebellum home, just beautiful. And we all took pictures on the steps. And as we were all dispersing, the descendants, and they broke us down according to, you know, all the descendants of Richard M. Johnson's slaves. And we all took pictures, and then his brothers, you know, so we took all these separate pictures. And as we were dispersing, Richard M. Johnson's great nephew, who is his namesake, looks just like him. We were in the museum, they have a wax figure of Richard M. Johnson. He stood next to him and he looked just like a twin. It was unbelievable. He's from Dallas, Texas. And we all had such a good time. He and his siblings, he has a brother that lives in Montana, and he and another sister live down in Texas. And they have another sibling, I forget where he lives at. But we were all sitting on the steps, and the sisters and one of the brothers started crying. Really? Yeah, they were crying. And they just said, you know, we just want to say, we know slavery was an atrocity, and we just want to apologize. This generation wants to apologize for any and all inequities and hardships that our forefathers placed upon you all. I said, oh, I think they're having a party in heaven right now, because it doesn't matter on that side. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing. So it was a wonderful experience to be in the presence of those descendants of Vice President Richard M. Johnson, and to hear their stories and for them to hear our story. It was just wonderful, a wonderful experience. I wouldn't exchange anything for that experience. And I need to, before I forget, because I've done this before, I need to get my little zip drive.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
We really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.